Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of College Football UK. As ever, I am your host, Fletch, and this podcast is brought to you by the AAW Network. Joining me as ever is my wonderful co-host, Nick. How are you, sir?
I'm fine, thank you. All good,
Good stuff.
as
And
usual.
as we all know, today is the beginning of our mini series where we're going to completely revolutionize college football. So, Greg Sankey, I know you're listening. All the college football commissioners, I know you're listening. It's time to get into it. And joining us today for the first episode is Stephen, Notre Dame fan. How are you, sir?
Grand, thanks.
We thought we'd get Nick some company over in Notre Dame land. Although I am feeling worryingly outnumbered against the team that is not generally considered a rival, but it's okay. We'll power through. I just know I have to be nice because otherwise I will get ganged up on, probably. Um, if you don't mind, before we properly get started, would you mind introducing yourself, but maybe letting us know why Notre Dame is your team of choice?
Um, NFL, American football fan since '82, since Channel 4 started showing it. I'm a Washington fan in the professional game. Around about 2000, it's probably getting a bit disillusioned with Washington, thanks to Mr. Snyder, who thankfully is finally gone. And just, I suppose, with the internet coming along, I knew college football existed as an NFL fan, but knew nothing about it. And as I started to read up about it and sort of follow it online, it was a wee bit later before sort of you could start to watch games here. And then being from Ireland and with the heritage there, and then the sort of the connections Notre Dame have, it was an obvious choice. But as I was saying like earlier, it's as much also about just I like Notre Dame, the Irish heritage and so on, but also just how they operate, how they try to do things the right way, how they're the whole
Yeah.
student athletes thing is something they take seriously, perhaps more so than other schools. And I probably it was more, to be honest, it was probably more about 2005 when Charlie Weiss came from the Patriots. And
Yeah.
I really sort of from then onwards, and obviously as the internet developed, it was easier and easier to watch and catch up with. Even if back in those days it was like the ESPN game tracker as opposed to actually
Yeah.
watching matches. And then just over the years, it's yourself the whole the ability to watch it on this side of the Atlantic has increased exponentially.
Yes.
Well, up to the point where ESPN sort of pulled out, unfortunately. But so I would say I'm a Notre Dame fan, but I'm also a huge college football fan. I love the sport. To be honest, I probably prefer it. I do prefer it over the NFL. I mean, I still
Yeah.
follow watching it and so on, but college football would be the primary love.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much. I was very glad to have you. I would have imagined that a lot of it would have cut. I think I could have imagined that the connection in the heritage and all that sort of stuff would have played a big role. But no, brilliant. Thank you very much. To get started properly on the episode, as always, we have Nick's news. Nick, will you get us started, please?
I will be delighted to, sir. Um, they have announced this week the College Hall of Fame ballot class for this year. Names on the ballot that you can vote for to go into this year's Hall of Fame are Mark Ingram, Cam Newton, RG3, and Ndomika Sue. So they are the guys available. And if it was my vote, I'd probably give it to Cam Newton. So
Feel a bit biased in this one. I do want to say in Indama King Su. But I would probably have to agree. Based on football, I would probably have to agree. Curious, who would you throw in there, Stephen?
Yeah, it's hard to go past Cam Newton for that 1 year in 2010. Although, given that offensive players often get sort of favored in these, I do have a soft spot for Sue because he was just
Yeah.
absolutely incredible. At the college level, I know, and often these things you sometimes get influenced by their NFL career, but just as a pure college player, he was an absolute game wrecker.
he's the only one on the list that hasn't won the Heisman as well. I think.
Mm.
I think the other three have.
But he won,
Ingram, Newton, and RG3.
yeah, but he won the real Heisman Trophy of playing for the Detroit Lions. So I
He's a Tampa Bay man.
won the real Heisman of playing for the Detroit Lions. I will have you know, and that's where we're gonna leave it.
Okay, moving on. Um, you will remember last year that there were a lot of storming the fields crowds storming the fields. But we talked about Arizona State earlier today in a separate episode. They had that massive problem right at the end of the at the end of the season, at the end of the game, when the game hadn't even finished and the crowd were all over the pitch. And
Yeah.
so the SEC have announced that fines for rushing the field will now be set at $500,000, $500,000 for all offences starting immediately. Because it used to be the first offence was 250, second offence was 500. That goes across the board for both basketball and football. Again, it used to be if basketball had a first offence, it was 250. Football's first offence was 250. Then it was 500 and 500 onwards. Whereas this one, it doesn't matter what sport it is, it will be 500 straight away. Boom, and we'll just continue to keep being 500. So, Greg Sankey, your mate, announced that yesterday, I think. And finally, the other bit of news I've got for you is the College Power Index has been released for this season. Nothing like being released too early. So, top of the pile, we have the Texas Longhorns. Second position are the Georgia Bulldogs. Third position, I'm not really. Alabama Crimson Tide in third. Ohio fourth. Ohio State Buckeyes fourth. Penn State five. Oregon Ducks six. The mighty Notre Dame in seven. Texas A&M eight. Miami Hurricanes nine. And the Tennessee Volunteers round out the top 10. Clemson currently are in 11. That is the early power index to start with. The way too early power index.
Lovely.
So,
I believe you had some. Did you have some stuff around college football 26 as well? So just some of the new
yeah,
additions.
yeah. Obviously, the gameplay is being changed. What they've announced is one of the biggest changes they've made is across platforms. So if you play on a PlayStation 5, for example, and somebody else plays on an Xbox, you are able to still play in the same Dynasty mode using the
All right.
cross plat. So you can play in the same Dynasty mode with people on different platforms. Um, there's dynamic substitutions. There's a wear and tear system. Um, there's real coaches. There's a whole list of things that have been added to improve the game. So as I never played College 25, it doesn't really matter to me.
Well, the one thing I'd want in there as well is I played quite a lot of college football 2025, and I really got into the build a career as a player.
Yeah,
I've been recently playing as a running back and worked my way up to RB1. The problem I had with the substitutions was every time I finally if I was getting busted up at the line, they were putting me in play after play after play. If I was finally getting a hot hand and I was getting yards and I was doing quite well, they'd take me out for a few plays and maybe even the rest of the drive, and it was just so annoying because I could never get momentum in the game as a running
yeah.
back. It's very frustrating. I also noticed there's a couple of other little things. I have one in here, in that Bill Belichick and Coach Deion Sanders will not be in the game.
Bill Belichick was never in Madden either,
No.
so he never signed. He never ever signed the deal to be in Madden. You always used to get that weird looking guy with the glasses as the Patriots coach.
Um, and the most important bit, let's face it, it's the bit we all care about. Um, Obviously Gary mentioned Enter
The entrance,
Sandman
yeah,
and West Virginia, but actually more importantly than that, I know that is probably the best one, but they've also included the Mr. Brightside by the Killers, which is sang at the big house every week. And apparently throughout the third and fourth quarter, it will start out as all of the song, and by the end of the fourth quarter, it'll tip, and then it will just be the fans singing, which I think is a
all
really
right,
cool.
yeah.
I don't know. I just Michigan aside, I think that's a really cool little thing that to add in there. Um, Also this week, though, the 5 Mountain West teams that have officially submitted their notifications of departure to head over to the newly formed Pac-12. That'd be Utah State, San Diego State, Boise State, Colorado State, and Fresno State. All of the states, and we have a group chat, don't we, across the UK and Irish college football media, where at the time all this was being announced, we all said that
The Pac-12 needs to be sponsored by Allstate, yeah.
Or State Farm. Has to be done.
State Farm or Allstate, yeah.
This is slightly old news, but I don't think we mentioned it on last week's pod. 5-star edge Richard Wesley, who previously committed to Oregon and did so by jumping in a swimming pool with Dan Lanning.
That was the Anchorman. That was the Anchorman cannonball.
Yeah,
wasn't it?
17 days later, decommits from Oregon. Decommitted from Oregon, which is lovely. Troy wide receiver Chris Lewis has medically retired. Is also mine. And I think we've got a true not too invested in our podcast. So what we do, Stephen, is Nick, when presenting the news, is Nick's news. Gary will get in, and that's Gary's Gazette. And then, unbeknownst to us, Sam got involved, and then it became Sam's supplement. So I've asked ChatGPT to help me out here because I couldn't think of many things that alliterated with Fletch. We've got Fletch's footnotes.
I like that one.
Yeah.
Fletch's forum. And there was one other one. Well, I think it was 2. Yeah. Can you help us out? Are any of those 2 particularly take your fancy?
But I like the footnotes more than forum.
Okay.
Yeah, we don't want you to have too bigger space to voice. You know, a forum's far too big for you. A little footnote at the bottom of the page, that's perfect for you.
Thanks. Thank you. That's
more importantly, sorry, go back to that Edge fella who decommitted from Oregon. Please tell me that he announced his decommitment by playing the first video backwards, so he jumps out of the swimming pool.
I don't believe he did. That would have been genius.
It's missed the trick there. Missed the trick. The one thing I will say about that though is fair play to him because he's finally, after all these years, taken the heat off Brian Kelly, he was formerly the most famous coach known for his recruiting videos and grinding up against 17-year-old recruits at LSU. But I think if we can now forget about that and just laugh at Dan Lanning instead.
I'm down for that. I'm down for a little bit of laughing at Dan Lanning.
I think Dan Lanning laughs at Dan Lanning, to be fair.
To be fair, I think you're probably right. Before we get into the crux of the episode, the house rules kind of the thing we do. Obviously, if you are watching it on YouTube, just look over here and now look where I'm. Just go down there, go past Stephen, and go into the description of the episode. And if you're listening on audio only, you've just missed all of that fantastic display. I was like cabin crew. Is what I'm running with. It's like cabin crew. You can go into the app that you are listening on, go into the episode, and then there's also a description in there. In there are a host of links that include to follow the AAW on the social media, to follow College Football UK on the social media, to follow myself, to follow Nick, and this week will also be to follow Stephen on social media. Go show everybody on this podcast, so low, please, and go check them out. And also is the link to join our Discord. Now, it's a long, arduous off-season, and we are there on Discord to chat through various different things with you. We've even had an argument over rappers this week, because that's what we do in American football Discords. We argue over rappers, because there is a music channel. Okay, so there's been some breaking news. We've woken up to the devastating news that the Big Ten, the SEC, and a few of the big schools have got their own way, and they have moved on from the NCAA and formed their own brand new, we'll call it for now, the Super League. The details are yet to be hashed out. To find out exactly who is yet to be hashed out, and we will find that out in 7 days' time. But the question remains is how on earth did we get to this position? Now, to break this down and how we got here is Nick, and that's what Stephen is here to help us do, is to help us break down how on earth college football got to this position. We've got a couple of talking points to go through. We'll try and let it flow as much as possible, but we do have some specific talking points. Now, Stephen, as you are our um, why the words just left
Guest.
my brain? Our yeah,
Guest is the word you're
our
looking for.
esteemed guest of the week. Is there a particular place that you'd like to start in terms of where college football has gone wrong?
Yeah, well, I think you calling it the Super League is very appropriate, particularly for those of us on this side of the Atlantic. If I'm showing my age here, but I would suggest everything that's gone wrong with football, or I'll call it soccer in the context of an American football podcast, but everything that's gone wrong with soccer, both in England, the Premier League, and Europe in the last 20, 30 years, can all be traced back to money. And that's why we're in a situation where they keep bringing forward this Super League idea, which presumably eventually will take place in terms of the top European clubs. And it's the same in college football. Why are Oklahoma in the Southeastern Conference? Why in the name of God are Stanford and Cal in the Atlantic Coast Conference? You know, you don't have
Yeah,
to be, you don't need an A level in geography to work out that Stanford and Cal are both not far from the sea, but it's not the Atlantic Ocean. Why are Southern Cal and Washington and Oregon and UCLA playing in Maryland and against Rutgers and going to State College, Pennsylvania?
yeah,
And the answer is money. Money, money,
yeah.
money. Why have all these rivalry games gone by the by? Why do Pitt and West Virginia not play every year? Why do Oklahoma and Nebraska no longer play every year? It's money. So if you're asking, if we wake up tomorrow, if we're waking up to this news and you ask me why, someone somewhere, or sorry, a group of people somewhere have waved larger checks in front of people, and in college sports, you make a bit of money from merchandise, you make a bit of money from concessions in the ground, stadiums, you make a bit more money from ticket sales, but those are all dwarfed by TV money. So
Yeah.
some set of TV executives somewhere have decided that there is more money to be made down the line by presumably some sort of super, not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but presumably some sort of Super League structure where there are
Yeah.
more Notre Dame versus Michigan and Alabama versus Penn State games as opposed to Michigan, Appalachian State, or Notre Dame, Northern Illinois, or
Yeah.
you know what I mean. The FCS teams, the bottom feeders, for not to be too offensive, you know what I mean.
Oh yeah,
Lower
yeah.
FBS teams, non-part group of five conferences, games, etc. It's all in the viewing figures and it's all in the TV money. So that will be whatever happens for good or bad. More likely bad, unfortunately, in the coming years, including something like this scenario we're discussing, will all be down to TV money. I think anyway.
I think succinctly, I think that's in the grand scheme of everything we'll probably talk about today, it will all come back to dollars and and cash. That will be everything, and it comes back round to. Nick, to summarize yourself, could you come up? Is there anything specifically you would also like to mention, just in terms of the grand scheme of how we got to this position?
I think I think we have to first focus on the NCAA. They have been asleep at the wheel for best part of a decade, if not more. They've been, I don't want to say abusing because that's not the right word. They have been taking advantage of student athletes, not paying them, and yet they have been pocketing all the money. And we have now come to a point where, of course, now NIL has come into play, and the NCAA are losing control over their their golden goose, if you like, and they're becoming unfit for purpose. So you're now getting this situation where NIL is running amok in college football because there's no rules to govern it, because you can't govern it because the people that govern the sport aren't fit for purpose, and they've been a competition infringement on competitive rights anyway. So
Yeah.
it goes back that far, and Stephen's right when he talks about the amount of money coming in. The amount of money has been coming in, and it all goes somewhere. Someone's getting rich, but you know, it's not the athletes that are playing the game. The coaches are taking their pennies. You know, Matt Rule got sacked from the NFL and walked straight back into college football and took a tidy, whatever it was, 7, 8 figure sum for his troubles. So, I think when you talk about what's gone wrong, the people at the top of the game have been asleep at the wheel for a long time.
Yeah. I think to tie the 2 points together about money and players, I think you're right. For years, the NCAA and courtrooms have, trumpeted this idea of the beauty of amateurism and how the sport would just go to the dogs, and people wouldn't even want to watch if these players were sullied by, the taint of receiving money. And they got away with that for a long time. And it was probably easier to get away with it in the past when the sums of money involved were lower, and the highest paid coach was maybe getting $1 million a year or whatever. But when coaches are getting $10 million a year, and the TV money is growing exponentially, it was just getting harder and harder to stand up in the courtroom with a straight face and say the people,
Yeah.
the coaches, the assistant coaches, the trainers, all the staff who work at the universities, the athletic directors, everybody who works in the stadium on game day, from the concession stands to the ushers to the journalist to the person on the TV camera, everyone else in this sport is getting their cut of huge sums of money. But the people that the 70, 80, 90, 100,000 people come to actually watch are getting absolutely nothing. And that had to break. And I mean, NIL, the NCAA are just they're a laughing stock. We even come back to things like the punishment or lack of it for North Carolina when they had institutional cheating in the actual school. And what was it they said? Because non-athletes benefited the same as athletes, we're not going to punish them. And then you have other schools who self-declare certain things and then get far harsher punishments. The NCAA have been a joke for years, and the stage, and you're now in an environment where states like Tennessee are just blatantly passing laws saying we don't care what you say, we're just going to pass a law that overrides it. Um,
Yep.
it's it's just a disaster. I do think though with a lot of people talk about how NIL has changed the game, and arguably for the worse in terms of play highest bidder and all that. I think it's more a combination of NIL and immediate transfers.
Yes.
No longer having to sit out a year, and B, being able to transfer virtually every year, and that I think has hurt the product with fans who no longer feel the connection. Not to go off on a bit of a tangent, but that's where fans maybe don't no longer feel a connection. I mean, funny, I saw something the other day. Now it's a different sport. It was basketball, but it was some fella who joined Notre Dame as a freshman and a basketball team, and then I think he went to maybe say it was it North Carolina and possibly Duke, and then he's going to play his fourth year at NC State. And like, going to four different schools in 4 years. Now, the point of the tweet was, God, he went to three relatively good academic schools, but he's going to end up with a degree from NC State. Haha. But, leaving that out of it, just, the idea of going to four schools in 4 years, how do you become a student? Where is the student and the student athlete part of that
Yeah.
equation? But then again, in this term context of this discussion, maybe we're moving in the completely opposite direction of the
So,
NFLization of college football, unfortunately.
yeah.
Yeah, I
I,
mean, you talk about,
yeah.
sorry, Fletch, you talk about the amateurism of, college football being sold as amateur thing. College football has never been amateurish, semi-pro at best. Semi-pros probably suits a better reflection on
Yeah.
college football. Amateur football. We know living over here, amateur football is the guys on in the parks. Saturday mornings, Sunday mornings, Saturday afternoons, getting absolutely obliterated in mud, and that's amateur football. And college football has been semi-pro for a long, long time, and we spoke about this at the end of the season about how so many players they play that last game and then they never play again because there isn't the amateur league, there isn't the amateur way to play tackle football. All right, I've played college football, I haven't made a living. I'm going to go and get a professional job. Hey, would you like to play tackle football on a Saturday? Oh yeah, I'd love that. That option isn't there for people. You can't do that out in the States. So, college football's never been amateurish. Semi-pros are much better wording.
And not to maybe jump too far ahead, and it might be more a topic for to discuss next week, but in the context of how what would this Super League look like? About another question in tandem is what will the rest of what is currently FBS football look like? Because
Yes.
the same things that apply today in terms of if you're recruiting somebody, and it's a big thing at schools like Notre Dame where there's a huge academic component, and they'll often say, come to Notre Dame, get a good degree, it'll set you up for life if you don't make it in the NFL, blah blah blah. And that's at the same time when you're trying to recruit five-star recruits, you're not telling them that. You're saying, look how many players we've put in the NFL. You're going to go to the NFL. You're brilliant. But the reality is, look at how many high school students enter FBS schools every year. Look how many leave to go, who graduate or leave the game with no more eligibility. And look how many people get drafted and add on a small number of undrafted free agents. There's so many more people who don't make it. So if you're going to professionalize it and remove the student athlete component, where does that leave all the people who play this sport and don't, if they're not student athletes, they're just athletes. Where are they if they don't get them? Because most of the reality is the majority and a large majority won't make it. You know.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just to kind of again, I want to throw us back a little bit. So to the point that you've made, Stephen, and the point that you've made, Nick, it comes down to, I think, two things. I think are primarily where we're at. And the tangent that you said you went on, I think, is absolutely relevant to the discussion. But it comes down to two things. One, poor governance, and two, money. And those are the two primary drivers on how we've allowed college football to get to a point where a group of schools feel that not one, the NCAA is no longer fit for purpose. Excuse me, and excuse me again. They are much better off in a much better, more stable future financially outside of that current structure. And I want to start off with the governance specifically, and I want to get a bit more into the governance, where this has gone wrong, what the NCAA have done wrong. And Nick, asleep at the wheel. So I know I said asleep at work then. Possibly, yeah. It ties in so lovely, almost as if you'd think I'd planned that. But they're asleep at the wheel for so long. The governance side of it, though, and I think if you want to look at it from a Notre Dame, a Michigan, an Ohio State, a Georgia, and Alabama perspective, you've got the voting power, and I know that the Power Four schools are also called autonomous four because they have slightly more autonomy over certain things, but in the vast majority, they have the same vote as in the NCAA as FCS schools. They have the same vote as D2 schools. They have equal voting power, and they don't want that because what's good for Notre Dame per se is not good for Sam Thomas, James State, who cater to 10,000 students every year as essentially a community college. It's what benefits and what doesn't benefit is so different, but the voting is equal.
Yeah.
The NCAA are often viewed as slow to react to the ever-changing world. So look at how slow they were to react to NIL, how slow they were to react to the transfer portal, and how tied down by bureaucracy the NCAA are. And you get into those committees by committees by committees, and the way that these things just take forever to move. The SEC Big Ten, for example, wanting more control over specifically NIL. You've also got things like the roster management, the transfer portal, again, in their voting power. And then, Stephen, I think you made an excellent point there that I don't think we wouldn't have brought up otherwise, is that you've got state governments, you've had federal government getting involved and undermining the NCAA at every given opportunity, it feels like. But I think the question I want to kind of start off with is we don't know obviously in this context right now, we don't know the schools that have done. We can obviously say that Georgia will be one of them, Alabama will be one of them, etc. The A4 schools, the schools that decide to leave, do you feel like are they allowed the entitlement to want to control everything themselves per themselves? Is there no room for NCAA governance? How
I see this, if we're talking about the specific example of like a Super League, you're effectively talking about what I would call the NFLization and
Yes.
of the sport. Much more harmonization, much more homogenization, which ironically goes against every reason why I love college football ahead of the NFL, because it's not homogenized. There's
Yeah.
so many cultural and regional differences, et cetera, et cetera. But I can see why in a very changing environment where, as of today, Wednesday night here, we're still waiting on the house settlement to see whether it's going to be accepted and so on. Schools don't know next year what their roster limit's going to be. They don't even know if this, salary cap in inverted commas of $20.5 million is going to be brought in. So I can see why those top schools would like to have a level playing field with definitive rules, with where you don't have a situation where some states are allowed to pay, allow their state schools to pay NIL money to high school students and others don't. And some states are bringing in zero income tax for on NIL payments, and there's not a level playing field. And I can understand why the top that sort of uniformity would appeal. Now, whether or not that can be achieved, I do think. I mean, I think there's what I worked out, something like 67 schools in the Power Four conferences at the minute, plus Notre Dame, call that 68.
Yeah.
I don't see there being a Super League with 68 teams. So I would worry for schools like Northwestern, Vanderbilt, where, to go back to the thing about the split of money. Teams like Alabama and Georgia probably look at Vanderbilt and think, why are they getting in general the same share as us? Obviously, qualifying for the playoffs can generate additional money and so on. And I suspect, if it without, we're seeing it already in the ACC, where the financial arrangements have been changed to suit effectively the bigger schools, or rather the schools with the bigger
Yeah.
TV audiences, that they get a bigger share of the pie. To obviously, and it's a zero sum game. So certain, lesser inverted comma schools, or less successful schools, or to be more precise, less watched schools, will get less of the money. So I think it all goes back to the money. I think you're talking, some schools will fall by the wayside, and presumably it'll be based on the finances. But yes, I think that the remaining teams will want more uniformity of rules and more certainty, and more, there will be some schools, and not to sort of use stereotypes too much, but I suspect there will be some northern schools that would be quite keen for there to be some strict rules around the financial arrangements, to
Yeah.
avoid the issues we had in the past around people paying outside of the rules. And stereotypically, it's more southern schools, although I think it's not just schools in the south that have broken rules around that in the past. But yeah. So I can see why, if you, and apart from anything else, I think the financial, not just the rules certainty, but financial certainty, because there's a lot of money going out of schools at the minute. Athletic departments, some of them, even in some of the bigger schools, are starting to
Yeah.
feel the pinch. And if you're about to bring in a salary cap, you can see why people would want certainty of income, certainty of rules, just more certainty generally.
Yeah. Amidst all the chaos, you would at least want some sort of order among that chaos. Nick, care to carry on
Yeah,
from that point? As I think,
yeah. I was going to touch back on the NCAA. We've got to this point because they've put their head in the sand and just not wanted to pay attention to problems that are right in front of their face. And you'll love that I'm going to use this as an example. I bring back I reference the Netflix Sign Stealer documentary. And when when they're in the um when they're in the inquest, and it's the four people from the NCAA, you know and it's the Michigan guy, his name's gone out of my head.
Connor Stallions.
Yeah, Connor Stallings is there with his lawyer, and his lawyer literally asked the NCAA the question, "Where did you get this from? This was on a closed computer system. How have you got it?" Oh well, oh, we can't possibly, and it's that that's a prime example of the NCAA not doing what they should be doing, because they're dealing with information that's been stolen. So why, it's especially over here in a court of law, if you're using information that's stolen, you can't use it in court. And I realize that wasn't a court proceeding, but that's a prime example of where the NCAA don't actually know what's going on right in front of them. And they're playing catch up. And they've been playing catch up for years. And they're letting the people like your mate Greg Sankey, they're letting the conferences dictate to them what they want. The SEC are getting so powerful that the NCAA can't stand up to them. And the SEC only need to get another conference or two on their side. And it's, the NCAA are just like, well, tail between the legs and off they go. So they can't control the people that they govern.
Yeah.
And effectively, you've got, you've got the teams governing themselves and making new rules. And, Stephen goes on about at the federal level and government level, you can't, different states have different tax rules and whatever else. You can't help that. That's beyond your control. But the NCAA are not even in control of what they should be. And that's why they've become unfit for purpose.
I do think there could be one perhaps unintended, well, semi-unintended consequence that could potentially be beneficial to the sport is that if they break away and form effectively a new governing body in relation to football or college football and specifically the Super League, as we're going to call it, does that mean, does that only apply to football? Because if it did, then, you could let the other men's basketball, women's basketball, baseball, etc. They could remain within the NCAA structures, and what that might suit as well is you could actually see a return to some of the old conferences where you would have for all non-football sports conferences would be truly geographic. USC's basketball team would be playing Oregon and Washington and Utah and whatever, and instead of playing Maryland and Rutgers. And if you could get back to that, actually could be beneficial for the student athletes in those other sports. If you just had a new, whatever you want to call it, Super League governance body, but maybe that's
you're killing me. I've done that all for next week. I've got I've got new divisions and everything ready for next week.
I was about to say that's maybe just a wee teaser for next week rather than today, but
yeah. And I think that the crux I think of where this comes from again is just I don't know how familiar either of you are with the Church of England. I grew up in the Church of England, and there was the running joke as I was there were two running jokes in kind of just growing up going there, and it was one: don't ever offer to do anything ever because you will be doing it for the rest of your life, and it's not even don't offer to make tea and serve biscuits afterwards because you'll do it forever. Don't let anybody, and that kind of coincides with don't let anybody know you are good at anything ever, because then you will be asked to do it, and then you start doing it forever. And the other bit was, well, no matter what you ever need doing, you've got to go to the committee, and then they've got to go to the committee that decides what happens for the committee. But then there's a committee for that, and then after you've gone through that, then you have to go to the other committee, and there's a committee for everything, to the point where even in this last 30 seconds, the word committee has just lost all meaning to me as a person. This is the problem when you get bogged down in bureaucratic. I want to say nonsense, but that may or may not be the right terminology for it. But the NCAA have been so bogged down in bureaucracy and been so bogged down in having to follow a specific process that goes through this, that goes through this, that goes through the committee, that goes through the right person, that goes to the next. But there is no real way to fast track these things. And there's no way to maybe give them a little bit of leeway whilst also complaining about them for the system that they built. They can't faster. So it's not, even if it's not being asleep at the wheel, it's a bit like, well, now we've got to go through the conveyor belt of anything. Before we can do anything about it, it's got to go through the conveyor belt. And they have to consult the D3 teams, and they have to consult the D2 teams, and they have to consult the FCS teams. And if you're going to do, I think what was a few years ago, it was like a small payment to be made to athletes to help them cover books
Yeah.
and various other things.
Stipend.
Yeah, the stipend, that was it. Obviously the D1, the FBS schools, your Power 4 schools wanted that. They can afford it, not a problem. Allowing that to happen and asking D2 schools, asking FCS schools, right, you can afford, well, you can pay them now, so go pay them the stipend of $2,000 to your 80 athletes, but then that's also got to go to your basketball team, your softball, women's softball team, your men's baseball team. They can't afford it. They just can't afford to do that. And the system in itself ties the system down if that becomes to make any sense
Yeah. I
into
think
wording.
Yeah, I think it touches on something that's been in the sort of the news recently through the president of the United States saying that he wanted, a committee to look, or not a committee, a small group, like a task force headed by Nick Saban, and that sort of ties into what a lot of people have said for years. God, one of the problems with college football is it doesn't have a college football commissioner. And but
Yes.
anytime that gets discussed, people always the first person to sort of think of is, oh, Nick Saban would be the ideal candidate. So, and that's, the problem, it's the difference between an organization being run by committees as opposed to having somebody in charge at the top. Or to continue your previous analogy, it's the difference between the Church of England and having a pope.
Yeah.
But you may just blame Henry VIII for that. We don't take responsibility as Catholics. You know. But no, I think a college football commissioner, whoever it was, somebody who maybe has the power to cut through a lot of the crap or bureaucracy at not all the time, but at certain
Yeah.
times, because you don't want to go the other direction of somebody who thinks they're God and has all overriding control and can
Yeah.
do whatever they want. And not that I'm thinking of anybody in the news at the minute, but it's getting that balance. But yeah, I think there could definitely be scope for you know, somebody to have a bit that it's not paralysis by analysis or by committee.
You,
Yeah.
That'll happen.
Fletch, you posted a picture on I think it was on your socials this week, and you had that you know um, stadium that was all blown up, and you had the two planes
Yeah.
flying over, and one was the SEC and one was the Big 12, I think it
Yeah.
was. I
Um,
realize for the people that are on that they don't people listening they don't know what I'm on about, but effectively that stadium is the NCAA, and it's just the conferences are just killing it. That picture in itself is a perfect display of what's going on. It is the conferences that are running amok and are destroying the NCAA, but the NCAA can't stand up for itself anyway.
yeah, and obviously you wouldn't guess this, but I didn't actually draw it myself or make it myself. I did
No,
use
I didn't think you did.
I did use intelligence that was artificial within that. And what I asked it to do was to create a post-apocalyptic
Yeah,
representation of college football and the two planes going over. The It looked a bit too actual war scene as if the SEC and the Big Ten. I didn't quite like the way it ended up looking on it. They were meant to be just these futuristic looking
yeah.
crafts who were going to because I don't want Greg Sankey at my door. I know it's my mate and all that. I don't want him at my door saying you painted us out to be war criminals here. But it said, yeah, post-apocalyptic, everything actually kind of dead and buried, and they are seemingly looking like this is the future, and we're taking you to the future. That's not how it came across. One really funny story about that is the one I posted just before. I didn't post the one with the planes on. I posted just the one of the derelict um
Stadium.
college football stadium. I asked ChatGPT, I said it created the one initiative that I put in the group, in the Discord group that we've got specifically for the podcast, and said, please, can you just remove the planes and keep everything else exactly the same? So what it did was it made the planes slightly different and made them look a bit more like, what are they called? The blimps. It looked a bit more like blimps. They put the actual SEC and Big Ten logos on there, so it couldn't be mistaken for anything else. And the outside of the stadium then said Old Trafford. That was ChatGPT. That was ChatGPT that did it, not me. And I just thought, the representation here of college football is Old Trafford Stadium, being taken on by the Big Ten and SEC. But the idea again is this is a bit post-apocalyptic, and where we're at right now is post-apocalyptic. We're waking up to mass destruction. We're waking up to, I don't know, to use maybe a different analogy, the spacecraft has left. The new colony has gone to live on Mars, and we've been left down here, and this is where we're at, and we're all wondering why this has happened. We don't know who's on the spacecraft yet, but we know that the spacecraft has gone. Is that I guess where I'm kind of going at with that kind of image, and that's the idea though, is that everything else is now being left to rot in disrepair. But and again, this is the question I think for the fourth episode in this series is how do you keep the life and the soul of college football, and whether that's the new thing can't, but as you've alluded to that prior, Stephen, that's where now the G5 and the FCS, and that's where the D2 and D3 schools they still keep that, and that's where you're gonna have to go and find it, or is it gonna be maybe they leave and it allows the new life to flourish and new things can come of it without the big bad schools that are stomping on the ground and killing the light under it.
I know Stephen said, go on, you carry on. Go on.
Sorry. No, I was going to say, like, it's a bit like you ever read in the newspapers, you'll see someone saying, oh, young people today, blah, blah, blah. And then you'll see clips of letters written in the 1980s and the 1960s and the 1920s and the 1890s, all saying the same thing about young people today. Yeah. And it's a bit like that with college football. You know, you can go back and find archives, even in the late 1800s, never mind the first half of the 20th century, where people are bemoaning, you know, college football's not what it was, the game's dying, and this change is going to, you know, kill the game completely and kill interest in it. And, you know, at the end of the day, college football is what, 50 years or so older than the NFL. It's the original American football, and it's been going for over 150 years, and it's still ridiculously popular. And, you know, the TV numbers bear that out. So I think no matter what, there will be, you know, it's so embedded in American sporting culture and culture generally, you know, from high school football on a Friday night to college football, you know, on fall Saturdays, that even if, you know, you end up with the Super League, and then you've got other, you know, whatever you want to call it for what's left with the rump of the Power Four and the Group of Five and so on. You know, there will be college football. It's just you know, I'm of an age where I look back on you know, European and English soccer 20, 30 years ago, and there's things about it that I like more than I like it today. On the other hand, you know, there's you know, there's always nostalgia, you know, never goes out of fashion. There'll always be, you know, the past is always better, but and our children will be saying the same, surely. But you know, college football will, you know, it will survive. There's just too much interest in it, not to. Whether it'll be it might not be the same, it'll be different, but you have to just enjoy what you can out of it.
Yeah. And for those of you who are watching on YouTube, this is only going to make sense to you guys, but that's the image that we posted on social media this morning. This morning. So you can see it there. If you're on audio only, again, head to the links in the description. You can go on social media. You can see it. I'll pin the post or something. Well, that's it for now. So
that stadium doesn't look like Old Trafford. The sky does look like Manchester.
It's scarily
that looks
so
like a good summer.
days.
That looks a good summer's day in Manchester. That sky, don't be silly.
Honestly, if when that sky comes out, you can bet your bottom dollar I will have my t-shirt off and be sat in Oyster Bar, drinking my. I've not been oyster in so long. I don't even know how much the pints are in there anymore. But it was actually, it generated me a few different ones, and it was the one after that, and I couldn't. As hilarious as a Manchester City fan, as hilarious as I would have been to have found to post Old Trafford looking like Old Trafford looks like that anyway, I believe at the moment.
I was going to say it is falling down anyway.
Yeah, I think it would have looked a bit silly. So that didn't get posted. The one with Old Trafford on the front. I did. It was funny though when it. I will share it probably at some point.
You need to
as like
send it to
a.
me anyway.
I will. I will. So that's where we're at, I think, with the NCAA's governance. I mean, we cannot. There's only so many times I think we can beat at this bush before, we're just consistently repeating ourselves. So I think to walk away from governance, I want to start to get into the financial side of things, and I'll start with to kind of ease us in the bit of a segue. It's how the NCAA does divvy and finance between schools. I've got some stats from the 2024. D1 schools received roughly 90% of all NCAA distributed money. That's 90%. D2 received, I think it was about 7% and D3 3%, but it roughly somewhere around those numbers. Power 4 conferences, now it was about $90 million. Sorry, yeah, Power 4 conferences are received nearly 5 times what G5 schools received. And if D1's already earning 90% more, to get 83% of that 90% between 4 conferences is really quite, you're already getting so much of that lion's share of money. The NCAA, though, it is at their discretion what is distributed to conferences. It is entirely at their discretion. Why are the NCAA, why are P4 schools, particularly the SEC and Big Ten, and I feel like I'm mentioning them a lot, by the way, and this is no personal gripe at the SEC and Big Ten, but they are the front runners in all of this. They are the faces of it, primarily the SEC. Why are they so irked by this?
Now, when you say money distributed by the NCAA directly, is that prize money or where's that money coming from now, as opposed to the TV contract money?
Uh, Give me 1 second. I will get that up for you because I did have it in this document.
I think the problem you have in that instance is you've got such a distribute. 90% is a shocking amount of money, and I think to distribute that in such a bad way is, I mean, how is it? How is an FCS school or a D2 school? How are they supposed to improve when they're not getting enough money from the effectively the people that govern the sport that they play? So again, it goes back to the NCAA again being unfit for purpose, but they can't even distribute funds correctly.
I think
Because at some point, someone's probably, well, we need more money because we're a bigger school and we need this and we need that. And, it's all about looking after the, the good guy. And, it doesn't matter whether it's college football or whether it's local government or whatever, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer.
Yeah.
Always has been.
I think it highlights the difference ironically, between although I've said earlier we're moving towards an NFLization of college football, and maybe in the context of a Super League, the money would be divided equally, but then again, it would be equally among the rich to the detriment of the poorer schools. But it's ironic, it's hugely ironic in the context of American politics and economics that the NFL is probably the single most socialist organization on the sporting organization on the planet. I mean, they literally share all their money equally. Now, okay, individual teams can keep some of their additional merchandise and so on, but with a salary cap in place, all that does is basically make the owners rich. It doesn't actually improve they can't put the extra money, like unlike in baseball, for example, they can't put the money into the roster. Whereas with college football, it's always been the richer schools, the bigger schools have demanded more, presumably on the basis that they bring more eyeballs to the TV screens. But I mean, in terms of I know from memory, the NCAA make a lot of their income actually from the basketball, the March
Yeah.
Madness men's basketball tournament. I don't know if their distributions of that money are based on performance, to what extent they're based on performance in basketball. Because obviously, for example, there's a lot of schools that are very good at basketball that don't even have a football team. So I'm not sure in terms of the crossover between the money you're talking about and TV money, but I think it's just the hugely capitalistic nature of college football is just that, the teams with the most fans and the most
Yeah.
viewers, most money, and there's not as much emphasis placed on, for example, trying to maybe redistribute money to promote the game to keep smaller schools going. And again, I think that's we're looking at it through a specific lens of people on this side of the Atlantic who maybe take a different approach to sports and redistribution of wealth and so on. In America, they take a very different approach, and I think that's reflected. Nowhere is that reflected more than in college football.
Yeah. So I've in the meantime, I've got some of that revenue, by the way, some of the revenue stats back up. So the NCAA revenue sources for 2024, they received $1.3 billion. That was primarily through four channels, media rights. 900 million of it a year was because of March Madness, as I've mentioned. Championship ticket sales, corporate sponsorships, investments, and other sources. The primary, but they're making $1.3 billion a year. 900 million of that is March Madness media rights. Then on to so to go into a bit more of the distribution, Division One teams received 89% of the revenue, which worked out at roughly 1.15 billion. As that went down into how that was divvied up, the Basketball Performance Fund was about 30% of the NCAA revenue, worked at about 390 million, went to D1 conferences, mostly men's basketball driven. They gave grants in aid fund, was about $221 million based on scholarships awarded. The sports sponsorship fund, $130 million based on a number of varsity teams. Student assistance fund for athlete emergency support, academic enhancement fund, academic programs for athletes, and there's a few other ways of doing it. How it was split via FBS and CFP revenue was split by Power 5 conferences got $450 million, whereas the G5 got $90 million. Notre Dame got $3.5 million as an annual flat payment, and other FCS, FBS admin had about so things like bowl hosting, NCAA expenses went to about $70 million. I don't want to get into the D3 breakdowns of funds. I'm sure no one wants that right now. But that is about as concise as I could get it for that.
Well, one of the things about you talk about the difference between D3, D2, and even between FCS and FBS is like there are then the current NCAA structure. There are differences, for example, primarily around scholarship limits and how many pay, 85 for at the top level. I think is it 60 or 60, 65, I think maybe at FCS and so on down to you've got Division 2, Division 3 schools with I think maybe either no scholarships at the bottom and maybe some partial scholarships in other
Yeah.
schools. So, the NCAA have in the past, for practical, pragmatic reasons, been open to having different levels and different rules in some areas. And not to double back too much what we were talking about before, but I think part of the problem is that, they haven't been flexible enough on, maybe having different rules for the very elite, the top level of schools at college football, which is why we're in this hypothetical situation today.
Yeah. Nick, do you have anything else to add on distribution of finances?
No, I've said my bit. The distribution of funds is wrong, regardless of where they come from. I think it's a whole. The thing is, it's such a mess. I don't think you could just fix this little bit here and then that will fix that and that will fix that. You can't do that.
No.
It's a rip everything out and start again because the problems are so entwined that you couldn't even try and repair it now.
Yeah.
It is
And
it's a lost cause.
I think most people, to the people who listen, say, particularly across the States, will be a lot more on it. And I know there's a lot of, as we all know, so many fantastic people who know so much about college football in the UK and in Ireland. But a good chunk of some of our listeners are brand new to the game. We've had a couple of conversations with people who are brand new to college football. So one thing I think is important to say, I did a bit of a week I was left to my own devices, which is never a good thing in any circumstance ever. But I was left to my own devices. Did like a welcome to college football. Like, here's a couple of things I think you need to know episode. Conferences, all that money is great, and all that goes on is great. But don't forget, there is no like the NFLization. And one thing I think, no, I'll get onto that later. Is when you have that central body, but conferences decide their own TV and media deals. Conferences decide their individual sponsorships. Conferences decide, and conferences as individuals have a lot of have a lot of their own autonomy in terms of things like that. Now, the SEC, the Big Ten, the ACC, and the Big 12 naturally have the bigger schools that have the bigger endowments, that have the better academic programs, that have all of these things that naturally bring the school in more money. They, over the years, have invested that into football, which has allowed them to run bigger football programs, which has made them more attractive to recruits, which has made them better programs, which has then brought in more money in TV and made the conferences bigger. So it's the monster has been allowed to kind of feed itself, and the Big Ten and the SEC just naturally have richer schools, and the conference as sporting gets richer, and they control how rich that is, but then still have to kind of be allowed to vote. And I think you look at the way the Premier League has gone over the last few years, and the way how now that's broken away from the Championship, League One, League Two, because the monster has just, once the monster was created, the monster kind of kept feeding itself, and allowed itself. And then you look at the Big Six, who at the point now then they dominated that pool and then wanted to go and kind of, look, we're too big for even the big pool now. We want to go into the ocean, and we want to go over there. But it's that conferences are allowed to do these things on their own already. And this is another, I think, part of the problem is that the level of autonomy that they have has allowed them to again, just to keep inwardly feeding the monster. Which then, like I say, internally just allows them to start beginning to run away with it.
They've been allowed to do that.
Yeah.
You know, it's rather than have the argument, rather than the NCAA sit down with the conferences and say, no, you are not going to do that. That is not good for football. That is not good for the game. It's just, well, we don't want to have this argument, so you go off and do what you want to do. You go off and do what you want to do, and don't come and bother us about it.
Yeah. But I do think, again, it's important to note that, like I say, it's yes, the P4 schools are getting these, the A4 schools are getting these things, but they are in a sense their own Premier Leagues. A while UG and then UG4, UG5s are their own championships and League Ones and League Twos, and they're just kind of being left to, you go figure this out yourselves, because we've got our thing now and we're really good at it. But then comes into, and I know I'm wary of time and things like that, which is a thing. I am usually wary of time. NIL, athlete compensation, and just the athletic side of things. So I want to include the transfer portal in this. You look at the decisions lately. We've spoke about the NCAA's governance and how often they've been made redundant. Specifically want to mention the NCAA versus Alston and the ongoing House versus NCAA problems that are going on, where the NCAA just, they're being told by the courts, you were wrong and you're going to fix it, and you completely undermine transfer portal being what it is, the NIL being what it is this the straw that's broke the camel's back more than the problem itself?
See, I don't think the transfer portal is a bad thing. I think the way that it works needs improving, but I don't think the transfer portal is a bad thing. We sat, excuse me, we sat here the other week, me and Sam, and we talked about Appalachian State and we talked about their recruitment and we said about how they'd lost these 3-star players that had moved on because they'd played at Appalachian State, they'd been attracted to better colleges and they'd moved away. But sure enough, Appalachian State were able to go into the transfer portal and pick up 3-star players from the likes of LSU, Tennessee, Clemson, that players that are way down the roster that want to play, that want to put game tape, that put game film down, so that in a few years' time, when it comes to their draft time, they've got footage on tape that can be seen. And so I think from that aspect, allowing players to do that, the transfer portal does work. Now, you shouldn't be able to transfer mid-season. You shouldn't be able to, do this and do that and, appear in the regular season for one team and then playoffs come, oh, well, I'm going to transfer out now, so that, uh, you know, some of the transfer portal is broken, but the premise of the transfer portal, I believe in. I think it's a good thing for students if they use it correctly. I want to. I'm Carson Beck. I want to transfer because I want to earn more money
No,
somewhere
you're not.
else.
You're Chris.
Right. Okay. But that's not using the transfer portal for the right purpose. I'm Joe Bloggs and I'm not getting a game because I'm fourth string QB. But if I go to this college, I'm starting QB. That's how you use the transfer portal. So if you use it correctly, it's a good thing. But there needs to be some governance on how you use it.
I think you need to ask, what's it for? Because I think in principle I agree with it, but I do think that it needs some significant changes. I think having 2 windows a year is unhelpful, and I do think we're moving towards a situation where there will only be one. It's just a debate of whether or not it's going to be winter or spring. Winter to me makes more sense, but I can understand why some of the top schools aren't happy because obviously for them it often happens in the middle of a playoff run, which makes life a lot harder all around. I mean, I don't like the 2 window system where you end up with ridiculous things like, was it the Texas Tech wide receiver who transferred out in winter, went somewhere else for whatever reason,
Yeah,
didn't like it and transferred back to
yeah.
Texas Tech in spring. That's a bit mad. Personally, and maybe this is probably a result of my Notre Dame bias and focusing on the student athlete bit of student athletes, is it or the student bit, sorry, of student athletes is I think people should only be allowed. I think the immediate being able to play immediately is what's really caused a huge, the huge increase in the number of people in the transfer portal. I can live with being allowed to play immediately and no longer having to sit a year out. But I do think that as an undergraduate, you should only be allowed to do that once. And once you've transferred that as an undergraduate, if you transfer once, that's it. You have to stay at your second school until you graduate. Once you've graduated, you can then play. If you want to go to a third school as a grad student, assuming you still have eligibility left, fine. But the reason I say that is to go back to touching something we talked about earlier. People transfer two, three, 4 times chasing this NFL dream, and that's grand. I'd love to see, and I've never somebody who has time at the time and inclination can do it. I'd love to see statistics around the people who make it in the NFL, even for the average of 3 years. How many of them played for one school, 2 schools, 3 schools, 4 schools of college? I strongly suspect that people who transfer, who play, or are registered for at least 3, if not 4 schools, have a much lower rate, a success rate. And my point is, the vast majority of, a large majority of college football players will never play it down in the NFL. And for them, the best single thing about being a college football player and being a student athlete is that hopefully they get a degree. that will be of some use to them in the rest of their lives.
Yeah.
And I think that the more you transfer, the harder it is, the more less likely you are to graduate, let alone, I'd love to see statistics around multiple transfers, never mind playing in the NFL, how many of them
Yeah.
graduate. Because when all's said and done, it's college football, they're supposed to be student athletes. For many of them, they should be I know it's not fashionable or sexy to say it, but they should be focusing at least in part on trying to get a degree that will set because as you
Absolutely.
said earlier, there is no Sunday morning tackle football and whatever the equivalent of Hackney Marshes is. That's when college football's done, their football career is over. They are adults that have to go on, 40 years in the workplace ahead of them. So, but
Yeah. It we I mean, when we talk to people over in the States, the amount of people I know who go to work and they know someone who did play college football at so and so. As soon as their college football career's over, as you say, it's nothing but a footnote that they bring up in conversation every now and again to say, "Do you know I once played against Cam Newton? Do you know I once batted a pass from Cam Newton in the fourth quarter of week 4 regular season game in the 2010 season or whatever." And I know of people like that. One of my really good friends over in the States, she talks about all the time. There's a guy who played for Baylor, as a defensive end, and he tells about how he never got a sack in any of the games where he played against future NFL quarterbacks, but he definitely touched them once or twice in there, and it becomes a footnote.
yeah.
And that's just again, like you say, that's the reality of the situation that you're in. And I think when you look at the NFL right now and you look at how it's not necessarily changed how the draft works, but NFL teams have come out and said that they don't look as favorably, just in terms of the draft prospect on players who've been and gone to one school, two school, three schools, four schools. They don't look as favorably upon them because the commitment level may not be there. And then you look
I
at
th-
you're very lucky if in the NFL to even just simply become a practice squad journeyman for a couple of years, and you go on one practice squad roster, you get dropped before the season, someone else picks you up, you get dropped, someone else picks you up. You're lucky to get that, given the amount of athletes that won't even get that. So as you say, you're about to embark on a life where you may have to move around a lot anyway. Enjoy the stability while you've got it. Do
I
you
think
have
I
a
think the the times or the amount of players that are multiple transfers now, the times of the NFL looking poorly on that or looking down on that are probably going to end up changing anyway because you're going to get more and more players that have changed schools multiple times that the NFL won't be able to ignore it.
well? Some of it's got to come down to what was the reason.
Yeah.
And if you
Yeah,
change it every 2 months, then that's no matter what, that's a problem. But is it, did you have at least good reason for making the second transfer? Were you not being offered the opportunity? Did someone else come in and genuinely offer you? But what was the reason and what was the motivation? And if look, sometimes you just aren't going to make it as the third wide receiver at Alabama. So you might just have to say, look, for my last year in college, I need to put tape out there. I'm going to go to Arkansas State.
I think it depends on NIL. NIL is the wild card in this because a
Yes.
lot of the times, one of the old way, people transferred because they weren't getting playing time. And if you had a prospect where you transferred the first time, you went from school A to school B because you weren't getting playing time at school A. You go to school B, you're still not getting playing time, and you go to school C. You have to wonder why weren't you getting playing time? But to
Yeah.
be fair, in this day and age, there's also, I think maybe you do need to drill down and look at the nuance of it because you might have somebody who maybe started at an FCS school. Was it Cam Ward? You start at an FCS school, then you go to a group of five school because you're so good in the FCS, and then you play very well in your group of five school, and all of a sudden a power four school A wants you because you're good, and B offers you a shit ton more money. So that's it's fair to say it's a nuanced conversation, but in general, I think there are a lot more people who transfer, who play or register or whatever on the books of three or four schools, and just their career goes nowhere. I think that's a lot more common, I suspect,
Yeah.
intuitively than your Cam Wards.
Yeah. Absolutely. Um, playoff control was something I wrote down in the notes, but actually, when you write again, it's a 3 a.m. thing. It's becoming a recurring thing now where you make silly mistakes at 3 a.m. Playoff control is not governed by the NCAA in any way, shape, or form. It's done in conjunction with, so they follow the rules of the game and whatnot that are given by the governing body, but it's not done in conjunction with the NCAA at all. They have no say over it. They don't get to say who goes in, who goes out. So that's not really a part of it. And this has been a fantastic discussion. I think we've covered a lot of different topics. We've managed to work our way through a lot of these. And I feel like we've covered a good chunk of why we've woke up this morning to post-apocalyptic college football, where Old Trafford is in tatters and flying blimps with Big Ten and SEC logos going on around everywhere. This is the position that we are hypothetically in. If I could ask the pair of you to provide almost, I know it's not a court of law, so but a closing statement, a summarizing, just a few sentences on why, how are we here, what's happened, what's gone so wrong, just to kind of summarize it up from your point of view. Would you be able to do that? And Stephen, I want to throw it to you first. I'm just going to put you straight on the spot there.
I don't know, but I would circle back to where I started from, which
Yeah.
is it's money. You know, the point I've been hammering at is it's all due to money, 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 TV money, and in conjunction with the point you guys have been raising about the ineptitude, incompetence, whatever you want to call it, whatever word beginning with in, that suits the NCAA. That is, it's a combination of those factors and basically, well, money stroke greed and NCAA incompetence. And just what I would say though is, if you've been listening to this conversation, let's tune in next week, because this conversation just raises so many questions. And even in our conversations, it's been hard not to jump ahead to, what are the outworkings? I mean, even when you said about playoff there, the first thing that came into my head when we talked about playoff was, and in the context of America being the world's most litigious society, if you have I mean, at the minute, in theory, the college football playoff is open to all 130 something FBS teams. If you have a Super League with 30, 40, 50 teams, whatever, the playoff is only open to those teams. Is that an antitrust suit waiting to happen? But again, maybe for a discussion for another time. So I think, yeah, I mean, this is just what we've done tonight is just scratch the surface almost of what has led to this, but there's an awful lot of talking and interesting things to be discussed next week and beyond about
Yeah.
what workings this might be.
I'll say the situation is hypothetical, but the best thing I think about this episode is none of the information we talk about is in the hypothetical yet. These are things that are happening and have happened, and it's a reality that we're currently maybe facing. I'm looking at facing in maybe not truly dark skies and dilapidated stadiums, but it's a reality that we're looking at potentially in the future where, again, to take the other analogy of the colony's leaving and going to Mars, and they're not telling us about it. But one day we wake up and there's a rocket in the sky and Elon Musk's waving at you saying goodbye. Enjoy life down there. So, Nick, if you could summarize this again yourself, where would you go with this?
I would say, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the listeners, you have listened to us here. We've stated our point. I don't think any of us have led you down the wrong path. We all are in agreement here that there is an issue. The issue is at the top, and as we all know, it flows downwards and quickly. And I think until those issues are resolved at the top at the very top, you are going to have nothing but a rotten inside. That's all I can say, because I don't think, as I said, a few minutes ago, this is not something that can be repaired. This is not like repairing a tire on a moving car. This is dead in the water. This is rip it out and start again.
Yeah. it's maybe not the nicest analogy, but I think you go there. You've got that with a house, and you're not going to go into a completely dilapidated, completely derelict old house and then just say, right, well, I'm just going to replace this floorboard and then we'll start and it'll be okay. No, let's just knock the building down. Everything's rotten. But also, again, I don't necessarily like this analogy, but it's a divorce, and sometimes you've got to be able to say, look, thanks for everything. It's been a good time, but unfortunately, we're no longer in the same place that we once were, and it's best for both parties if we just move on and go our separate ways. And unfortunately, there's a lot of mess that goes on in that. There are the children who are some of the schools who get caught up in the middle of it, and then there are the friends and the family members who are the fans who are unfortunately just kind of get had to sit there and watch it all happen. And you make your friends along the way as a couple. You make your friend. By the way, my wife, if she wasn't fast asleep right now, would probably be very worried that I've clearly thought divorce through so well. But as that kind of happens, you make friends, and and friends have to choose which one. Who are you going to go and see? Whose house are you attending on a weekend and going for a drink with? Who are you? And we just have to sit there and watch it all happen, and just it's out of our control. Other than us three, because obviously, like I say, Greg Sankey and all the other commissions that listen to this podcast and are taking notes, based on what we say, which I think is a smart idea. But it's the position that we're in, and it's happening. And so, Nick, I don't know if you've had a chance to look at the doc that I did put forward. I know you just have the link saved and you open up and just raw dog it every week.
Really, that's the expression you're going to go with? Go on, yeah.
So I feel like I do kind of feel like we need Gary and Sam for it, but you proposed an idea last week, a topic to cover. Do you want to save it until after?
I'm quite happy to do whatever you think's best. I think
It's got nothing to do with the actual episode and the topic that we're covering. And I can see you're not in the doc yet because I've got the doc in front of me and your little llama hasn't shown up.
yeah.
But I will say that on Saturday, Mrs. Fletch, little lady Fletch, and I all went to go watch Lilo and Stitch. And it got me thinking about a question that Nick asked last week. And I don't want to get into the true nitty-gritty of it, but it is a Disney film.
Oh yeah, to be
Yeah.
honest, right now I'm with you. Based on what we said, I completely forgot. I haven't even done mine yet.
Right, okay then, so maybe not, right?
Sorry, I'm with you now. I was completely well away with the fairies then. I
Well,
apologize.
I'll tell you what then, we'll save that for another day. I know Stephen's chomping at the bit to tell us his ultimate Disney football team to put together. If you do want to throw out any suggestions there right now, please feel free. But I want to ask you a couple of questions just before we head off. And Notre Dame reaching the college football playoff final last year, runners up in the national championship. How are you feeling going into the 2026 sorry 2025 season even? I'm living in the future apparently. How are you feeling going into it, bringing it back? Confident of another run, another national championship run?
Extremely concerned, primarily because I don't really have anything to be overly concerned about, and that's Notre Dame fans have a thing they call BK PTSD, Brian Kelly post-traumatic was it stress disorder. We're so used to, especially on the Brian Kelly era, of getting close but not being good enough to make it. And there's always something went wrong, and Brian Kelly usually had an excuse to match it. Notre Dame's roster is the strongest it's been in my lifetime. Their head coach is going into his fourth year. He'll be a better head coach than he was last year. Last year, he was a better head coach in the first 2 years, etc., etc. Last year, he outcoached Kirby Smart in the Sugar Bowl, playing against the SEC champions, and he beat James Franklin. You can decide whether that's a huge achievement in a big game or not. Um, Notre Dame's offensive line should be at the worst top 15, potentially top five Joe Moore Award finalists. They've the joint best running back room in college football, along with Penn State. I would argue Notre Dame's is deeper. Wide receivers will be interesting. Malachi Fields hits the ground running, literally and figuratively. They will be very impressive. I mean, Jaden Greathouse alone should be very good this year. And the main I mean, CJ Carr presumably will win the quarterback battle if he's as good as advertised and even close to. Um, with the defense, I mean, the question on the marking defense really is around Chris Ice, the new coordinator. But they have, I mean, although they've lost a few key people, they have a huge amount of talent coming back, particularly on the defensive line for a change. On paper, they are very well set up if they can avoid injuries. And even last year, did some ridiculous injuries and still made the final. So on paper, yes, there's huge amounts of reason to be probably more optimistic this season than at any time since the late Louis Holtz era in the early 90s. So yeah, I'm basically just waiting to see what goes wrong. Um, Having said that, if I mean, like take last season, I was hugely nervous going into the A&M game. They won, played as well as you could hope in the circumstances, and then you had Northern Illinois the next week. This year, I mean, if they can get through Miami on the road and then Texas A&M, the rest of the schedule is more difficult than last year, but it shapes, it's certainly doable. That said, I mean, it's the start of June. Who knows which, Arkansas on the road could be a really tough game, or they could be absolute dung. Boise State at home could be very tricky. It's just hard to know. But yes, on paper, there's an awful lot to be optimistic about. I'm just sort of through too many years of experience, wonder what's going to be happening. And the final thing I'd say is, in terms of the playoffs, and obviously the format might change, a lot of it will depend on injuries and just who you play, the luck of the draw, and also where other teams are. I mean, Georgia last year were SEC champions, but that wasn't the best Georgia team in the last 3 or 4 years. Penn State or Penn State, I mean, that was a dogfight. That could have went either way. Truth be told, we could have lost that as easily as win it. And finally, when we had, the injuries really kicked home against an Ohio State team that just had a better roster. And that, if we had a run into Oregon last year, that might have been a problem. Might not depend. Oregon were a bit up and down. They weren't there.
Yeah.
But that could have been a problem this year. I mean, if Texas, I in a similar position to us, very talented, but not exactly sure how good the quarterback is. Texas could be really good this year. Cade Klubnik at Clemson is a more than decent quarterback. If he improves at the rate he has been, Clemson. I mean, if you told me it was Texas, Clemson, Notre Dame, and I don't know another, Ohio State or Georgia, Alabama, I think are one to watch this year. They have an awful lot of talent, and their head coach is better than he showed last year. If you told me it was Alabama, Notre Dame, Texas, and Clemson in the semi-finals, I wouldn't be hugely surprised. And if you asked me who was going to win out of that, even if you threw Ohio State or Georgia into that mix, I would just say pick a name out of a hat. I don't think any one of those teams is so much better than the others, and it'll just come down to luck, turnovers on the day, the odd play call here or there. I actually think it's shaping up to be a really good season
Yeah.
as a college football fan as opposed to just a Notre Dame fan.
Yeah, I mean, I want to throw LSU in there as well. I like what Garrett Nussmeier's doing. I like Garrett Nussmeier, and how, and not just maybe as well with Brian Kelly in there. That could be that'd be. I think that as a neutral, that would be a fun one. Seeing, say you get to the CFE semi-final and you've got Brian Kelly versus Notre Dame, that'd be an interesting one.
I would just one thing I'd say about that. I actually LSU probably would be my favorite SEC team pre Brian Kelly and post Brian Kelly. And that makes me sound like a real Brian Kelly hater. I'm actually not in the context of Notre Dame fans. I'm probably one of the least one with sort of the least antipathy towards him. I admire what he did at Notre Dame and how much better he left the program than when he came. The one thing I would say is I think and it's not even Brian Kelly's fault. Their athletic director has saddled them with an awful lot of tough week one games, and on the road at Clemson this season of all seasons.
Yeah.
I can see them going 0-1, still being a good team. Now, if they get to 10-2 with a loss at Clemson, that probably gets them in. I could see them being 9-3 with a loss at Clemson, and then it'll just come down to how good their wins were. If their three defeats are basically their three hardest games, then they'd actually almost be better losing to a Mississippi State or an Arkansas and being 9-3, and then having maybe a win over Alabama or some of the better SEC teams. But with Brian Kelly, I'll believe it when I see it, and I don't mean even that as a just you slagging him off for the sake of it. I
Yeah.
just think when I see what he achieved with Jaden Daniels at quarterback and that offense, I'm not going to, I'd want to wait and see with the, he has the players, but well, when he demonstrates it on the field at LSU, I'll believe it. But yeah, I'd agree. I think they certainly do have the potential to be a 10-2 playoff team.
Nick, do you want to? Is there anything you got to close out for today?
No,
Anything you feel like you need to end with?
No, I'm quite happy to leave it there. I'll be
Lovely.
backing Clemson again as my division winners this year, as I was the only one that backed them last year. I'll back them again.
Yeah. Lovely. Well, it goes without any further. Well, without any. Yeah. Whatever. Without any more mention, to say a huge thank you, Stephen, for joining us today. Obviously we've back and forth on social media platforms a bit, but it's nice to actually properly put your face in your voice and chat with you in person and put all of that together. Thank you so much.
No bother. Thank you for having me on. And again, nice to put faces and voices to names.
So next week we'll continue the series and we will be putting together the structure of this new league. Now we'll find out who those teams were on the spaceship. We will find out who has moved and then what order and how we're putting them. I know Nick has done hours and hours and hours of homework on it, and it sounds probably coming from my voice, it's very sarcastic. No, I mean it. He's putting hours of homework on this one. I've managed to get a little bit of a glimpse of some of the things he's put together, and I think the episode's already pretty much written and done, and we might just let Nick monologue next week instead.
Thanks.
You're welcome. But it's going to be a really interesting one. I think we hopefully have some really good discourse around it. Hope to see you all next week. Again, check the description for all the links that we need to go follow AAW, CFB, to follow Nick, myself, and Stephen. And check it. Oh, that was it. That was the one thing I wanted to mention. On Sunday, we have a very special interview landing on the AAW Network's YouTube channel and on the audio RSS feed of this podcast. So go and check that out. It'll be a special bonus episode landing on Sunday. If you want to find out who it is, join the Discord in the description of this episode. And we'll see you next week.